On the morning of April 17, 2026, a modest Qatari delegation touched down at Ottawa's McDonald-Cartier International Airport. There was no press release, no formal advance notification, no ceremonial guard standing at attention on the tarmac. Just 3 black vehicles, a discreet RCMP escort, and a motorcade that moved swiftly from the runway to a downtown conference room. The delegation comprised the Qatari Minister of State for Energy Affairs, the Chief Executive of Qatar Energy, and 2 senior officials from the Qatar Investment Authority, the sovereign wealth fund believed to manage in excess of $500 billion in Qatari state assets. They were received by Canada's Minister of Natural Resources, by senior officials from Global Affairs Canada, and in a 40-minute closed session that appeared on no public calendar, by the Prime Minister himself. 3 days later, on the morning of April 20th, a joint statement was released. No cameras, no ceremony, just a brief, meticulously worded document posted simultaneously on the websites of Qatar Energy and Natural Resources Canada. The statement announced what both parties described as a comprehensive framework for infrastructure cooperation, covering liquefied natural gas development, pipeline build-out, and Pacific Coast export capacity. The document used the word framework, but the accompanying annex contains specific financial commitments, specific construction timelines, and a specific target date of 2030 for initial project delivery. This is not a memorandum of understanding. This is not a preliminary conversation about theoretical future possibilities. This is Qatar, the world's dominant exporter of liquefied natural gas for the past 2 decades, establishing a strategic foothold inside Canadian energy infrastructure, and doing so at a pace that sovereign energy diplomacy has almost never previously achieved. And Qatar is not moving alone. Tonight, we're going to trace the anatomy of that agreement in full. We're going to examine what Qatar is genuinely acquiring, what Canada is genuinely offering, and why this specific combination of partners constitutes the single most unambiguous signal, yet that the Gulf's strategic alignment with Washington is fracturing in ways that will endure far beyond the current conflict, for decades to come. We are going to examine what the United Arab Emirates is simultaneously executing, what Saudi Arabia is signaling through its own infrastructure investment apparatus, and why every Gulf capital has quietly arrived over the past 6 weeks at the identical conclusion that depending on American security guarantees for their energy exports is no longer a tenable long-term strategy. If this category of analysis is precisely why you are here, if you want to understand where these tectonic shifts are heading before the mainstream headlines manage to catch up, hit subscribe now and activate your notifications. Because what is unfolding between Doha and Ottawa this week is only the opening passage of a considerably larger story, and the pace of it is accelerating. Let us begin with a fundamental question. Why is Qatar in Ottawa at all? Because to fully appreciate the magnitude of what was formalized this week, you need to understand the precise position Qatar occupied on the morning of February 28th. Before the war, Qatar was not a nation that required partners out of vulnerability. It was the nation that every other country urgently sought to partner with. Qatar holds the 3rd largest proven natural gas reserves on the planet. The North Field, shared with Iran, is by sheer volume the largest natural gas reservoir ever identified. Qatar Energy's production complex at Ras Laffan Industrial City on the country's northeastern coastline is among the most technically sophisticated LNG export facilities ever constructed, with existing nameplate capacity of roughly 77 million tons per annum and a massive expansion program designed to push output beyond 140 million tons per annum before the end of the decade. For 20 years, Qatar was the reference-grade supplier. When a Japanese utility required a baseload LNG contract, it signed with Qatar. When a South Korean power generator sought long-term supply security, it signed with Qatar. When Germany was scrambling to replace Russian gas in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, it signed with Qatar. The commercial proposition was uncomplicated. Qatar had the volumes. Qatar had the infrastructure. Qatar had the operational track record. That entire commercial identity rested on a single foundational assumption. that Qatari cargoes could physically depart Qatar. Every LNG carrier loading at Ras Laffan must transit the Strait of Hormuz. There is no alternative corridor. There is no Mediterranean pipeline. There is no overland route capable of moving the volumes Qatar produces. The gas flows out of the North Field. It is liquefied at Ras Laffan. It is loaded onto a carrier. And that carrier sails through a 21-mile-wide choke point that has now been closed, mined, and blockaded for over 7 consecutive weeks. Qatar's entire operational model runs through that single passage. And on February 28th, that passage stopped functioning. The damage to Qatari production infrastructure itself has been severe. Qatar Energy announced in early April that Iranian strikes on a critical gas processing facility during the opening hours of the conflict would require 3 to 5 years to repair. 3 to 5 years. In LNG market terms, that is not a temporary disruption. That is a structural reorganization. Qatar's long-term supply commitments to buyers across Japan, South Korea, China, India, and the European Union were constructed on production projections that no longer exist. The volumes have evaporated. The delivery windows have collapsed. And even the volumes Qatar can still produce are accumulating in storage tanks because the vessels required to transport them cannot safely navigate the blockaded strait. So, when the Qatari delegation landed in Ottawa this past week, they were not arriving as the commanding force in the global LNG market approaching a smaller counterpart for a partnership of convenience. They were arriving as a producer whose core export geography has been structurally compromised, a producer searching for a platform through which it can continue to honor the obligations to Asian and European buyers that underwrote its national prosperity in the first place. Canada has that platform, or more precisely, Canada has the specific platform Qatar needs most. The LNG Canada facility at Kitimat in British Columbia, operated by a consortium including Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Korea Gas Corporation, carries a first phase nameplate capacity of 14 million tons per annum. A second phase, already formally approved and actively under construction, would double that output. The Woodfibre LNG project near Squamish has been advancing along its own commissioning timeline. The Cedar LNG project, a partnership with the Haisla Nation, contributes additional Pacific Coast export capacity. And the pipeline corridor capable of moving significantly larger natural gas volumes from Alberta and northeastern British Columbia to those terminals has been subject to accelerated regulatory fast-tracking since Prime Minister Carney assumed office. What Qatar lacks, Canada possesses. What Canada lacks, Qatar commands in abundance. Canada has West Coast export infrastructure oriented directly toward Pacific markets, infrastructure that requires no transit through the Strait of Hormuz, no transit through the Bab el-Mandeb, no transit through the Suez Canal. Its cargoes can sail directly from Kitimat to Yokohama, to Incheon, to Shanghai, to Kaohsiung, in a fraction of the transit time a Qatari cargo requires when the strait is open, and with none of the war risk insurance premium when it is not. What Canada does not possess, by contrast, is Qatar's scale of deployable capital. It does not have Qatar's established commercial relationships with every significant Asian and European LNG buyer. It does not have Qatar Energy's 3 decades of operational mastery running the world's most sophisticated LNG trading operation. Those are precisely the assets Qatar is placing on the table. The framework formalized this week reportedly encompasses 4 distinct components. First, a direct equity investment by Qatar Energy and the Qatar Investment Authority into the second phase expansion of LNG Canada, with participation also in Cedar LNG and Woodfibre LNG. The aggregate scale of that combined commitment has not been officially disclosed, but reporting indicates it falls in the range of $15 to $20 billion, which would rank it among the largest single-country foreign direct investment commitments in Canadian history. Second, a long-term offtake arrangement under which Qatar Energy will market Canadian LNG to its existing Asian and European customer base, utilizing its established commercial infrastructure. This element is what the Qatari delegation has reportedly characterized as using the Canadian platform to continue honoring Qatari obligations. In operational terms, Qatar is redirecting its existing buyer relationships through Canadian supply. Third, a joint technical cooperation program through which Qatar Energy will contribute expertise, engineering talent, and operational knowledge to accelerate the development of Canadian LNG capacity beyond what currently approved projects would achieve on their own trajectory. This component carries enormous practical significance because Canada's primary constraint is not resource availability, it is execution velocity. Qatar knows how to move at pace on precisely this category of infrastructure project. That knowledge transfer is substantively and commercially valuable. Fourth, and this is the dimension that the bulk of mainstream coverage has entirely overlooked, a pipeline development cooperation clause. The public statement's language on this point is deliberately ambiguous, but sources with direct knowledge of the negotiations have indicated that Qatar is prepared to invest in expanded natural gas pipeline capacity from Alberta and northeastern British Columbia to the Pacific coastline, including potentially in infrastructure that could accommodate eastbound flows to serve additional export terminals in future development phases. Taken in aggregate, this is not a commercial transaction. It is the relocation of a substantial portion of Qatar's export strategy from the Persian Gulf to the Pacific coast of North America. And it has been negotiated, formalized, and publicly announced at a speed that national energy policy almost never achieves. The entire framework has progressed from preliminary conversations in late March to a binding document in approximately 4 weeks. Hit the like button if this analysis is connecting dimensions of this story you have not encountered connected elsewhere, because what unfolds next affects considerably more than one pipeline, one terminal, and one bilateral arrangement. Qatar is the first Gulf producer to execute a framework of this depth with Canada. But it is not the only Gulf producer currently in motion. And the regional pattern strongly suggests that this week's announcement is not an outlier. It is a leading edge. The United Arab Emirates, through Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and its investment vehicle Mubadala, has been engaged in what informed sources describe as exploratory but substantive discussions with Canadian producers covering downstream refining partnerships, pipeline equity positions, and LNG offtake arrangements. ADNOC's chief executive Sultan Al Jaber has delivered repeated public statements since the war's commencement about the imperative for resilient supply chains and alternative export corridors. Those statements were initially interpreted as diplomatic language about the blockade situation. In retrospect, they were strategic positioning. Al Jaber was communicating to the market precisely where ADNOC intended to move. The UAE has now reportedly tasked its investment arm with conducting formal assessments of direct equity participation in specific Canadian projects, with an initial decision expected before the close of the second quarter. Saudi Arabia is moving differently, but it is moving. The Public Investment Fund, which has served as the primary vehicle for Vision 2030 economic diversification, has reportedly increased its exposure to Canadian energy infrastructure through both direct equity positions in pipeline operators and through portfolio allocations in Canadian energy producers. Saudi Aramco has not yet replicated Qatar Energy's approach with a formal bilateral framework, but the pattern of Saudi capital deployment over the past 6 weeks suggests that Riyadh is quietly accomplishing through investment what Doha is openly executing through government-to-government agreement. Kuwait's sovereign wealth fund, the Kuwait Investment Authority, has reportedly been active in Canadian energy debt markets and has quietly assembled significant positions in Canadian pipeline operators. Oman has signaled interest in cooperation on specific downstream projects. Even Bahrain, which carries the most modest sovereign wealth profile among the Gulf states, has reportedly explored participation through its pension investment vehicles. The pattern is beyond dispute. Every Gulf state with meaningful capital deployment capacity is either already positioned inside Canadian energy infrastructure or is actively moving toward it. And they're doing so at a velocity that Gulf sovereign wealth deployment rarely matches.
Why?
Because every one of these states has observed the same 6 weeks that the rest of the world has observed. And every one of them has arrived at the same conclusion. The assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would remain perpetually open, the assumption that underwrote 40 years of Gulf economic architecture, the assumption that transformed Doha and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh into the financial centers they are today, is gone. And even if the strait reopens tomorrow, even if every mine is cleared and every tanker resumes its normal route, the assumption is gone. You do not rebuild an assumption of that magnitude. You replace it. And the replacement, for every Gulf producer that has genuinely thought through the next 20 years of its national economic trajectory, increasingly resembles diversified export geography, anchored on the Pacific coast of a G7 democracy that is not currently within the targeting calculus of any plausible state actor's military planning. There is a deeper dimension to this story that deserves direct and unsparing attention because it is the dimension that most commentary is still carefully avoiding. The Gulf states are not merely diversifying their export geography. They are diversifying their strategic relationship with the United States. For 50 years, the foundational bargain of the Gulf political order operated on a straightforward logic. The Gulf states export hydrocarbons to global markets. The United States provides security guarantees for that export infrastructure, principally freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Gulf capital cycles back through American financial markets, American real estate, American defense procurement, and American treasury instruments. Every participant benefits. The system sustains itself. That system depends entirely on American security guarantees being both credible and reliable. Over the past 6 weeks, both dimensions of that credibility have absorbed damage that Gulf capitals are not going to forget. The reliability problem surfaced first. The blockade announced by the Trump administration on April 12 was not conceived as a defensive posture. It was an offensive instrument calibrated to apply pressure on Iran. But its side effect, whether intentional or not, was that Gulf producers who had done nothing to precipitate the blockade suddenly discovered their own export infrastructure held hostage to a bilateral American-Iranian confrontation they had not chosen to enter. Qatari gas could not depart Ras Laffan. Emirati crude could not leave Fujairah on reliable terms. Saudi tankers could not load at Ras Tanura without calculating whether American naval assets would permit their passage. The Gulf states were not consulted before the blockade was announced. They were informed. And, according to reporting from regional outlets, several of them were informed only hours before the public statement was released. The message that transmitted to every Gulf capital was unambiguous. American strategic decisions affecting your core national economic infrastructure can be made without your input, executed without your consent, and sustained without your approval. The credibility problem arrived second, and it is, if anything, more corrosive. The United States and its allies have historically positioned themselves as the guarantors of freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. That guarantee was the entire structural foundation of Gulf confidence in the American partnership. But the current blockade has inverted that guarantee entirely. Freedom of navigation, in the Gulf's recent operational experience, is not a service the United States provides as a matter of principle. It is a privilege the United States grants, can withdraw, and can redeploy as a coercive instrument against a neighboring state whenever strategic circumstances are judged to justify it. That is a fundamentally different relationship than the one the Gulf states believed they had constructed. And every finance minister, every central bank governor, every sovereign wealth fund director across every Gulf capital has spent the past 2 weeks conducting a sober reassessment of their exposure to American institutional reliability. The collective answer they have reached, with remarkable speed and convergence, is that the exposure is dangerously concentrated and that the alternatives must be constructed now. Canada is not the sole alternative those capitals are examining. Regional infrastructure within the Gulf itself. Overland pipelines to the Red Sea, expanded throughput capacity via the Suez Canal, partnerships with African producers. All of these are simultaneously in motion. But Canada offers something that none of those alternatives can replicate. It is politically stable. It is geographically independent of the Middle East. It is a G7 democracy with a robust and transparent legal framework for foreign investment. It carries surplus resource capacity awaiting export infrastructure. And its current government has explicitly committed, through Prime Minister Carney's recent series of policy repositioning, to accelerating the build-out of that infrastructure as a declared national priority. Qatar's framework with Canada represents, in that broader context, the most publicly visible expression of a realignment that is also unfolding less visibly across a dozen simultaneous conversations. And the visibility is itself a strategic act. Qatar did not require a public announcement. The framework could have been structured through private equity vehicles, through trading subsidiaries, through commercial arrangements that would not have generated a single headline. The fact that it was announced publicly, with both governments visibly attached, with named officials and specific financial parameters, is itself a communication. Qatar is signaling that its strategic alignment is no longer exclusively anchored to Washington. And Qatar is deliberately ensuring that Washington registers that signal with clarity. That signal is being received in Washington. Whether it will be comprehended or responded to constructively is an entirely separate question. Because here is the dimension of this story that demands the most disciplined analytical attention. The Trump administration's posture over the past 8 days has been consistent, public, and aggressive. The president has issued repeated statements emphasizing American resolve, American capability, and American willingness to enforce the blockade against any vessel attempting unauthorized passage. Those statements are oriented primarily toward Iran. But they are being received across the entire Gulf as declarations about the nature of American power and the conditions under which it is deployed. The Gulf states are not intimidated by American power. They are long-standing customers of it. What concerns them is that American power, as currently configured, does not appear to incorporate the specific interests of long-term American partners into its strategic calculus. The blockade is not only pressuring Iran. It is simultaneously pressuring Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain. And the Gulf states have reached the uncomfortable but unavoidable conclusion that they need insurance against being pressured by the same mechanism in a future confrontation that has not yet occurred. That insurance is precisely what they are constructing right now. And the Qatar framework made it visible to the world this week. There is another dimension of the Qatari calculation that merits direct examination because it illuminates precisely why this framework was executed in April rather than a year or 5 years from now. Qatar's national budget is overwhelmingly dependent on hydrocarbon export revenues. The Qatar Energy Expansion Program, designed to push the country's LNG output past 140 million tons per annum by decade's end, was not a commercial aspiration. It was a national economic strategy. The revenue projections from that expansion had already been embedded into Qatari fiscal planning, Qatari sovereign wealth deployment timelines, and Qatari domestic development expenditure. Every quarter that Ras Laffan operates at suppressed throughput due to Hormuz disruption is a quarter of forfeited revenue that must be absorbed somewhere. And the somewhere is Qatari reserves. The sovereign wealth fund is substantial, but it is not infinite. And more critically, drawing down reserves to compensate for operational revenue shortfalls is precisely the category of fiscal behavior that credit rating agencies, sovereign bond investors, and strategic partners actively monitor. Qatar cannot afford to spend 3 to 5 years explaining to its financial counterparties why operational revenues are running below forecast while gas field repairs are completed. It needs a revenue replacement strategy. And it needs that strategy to be visible, bankable, and executable within a time frame measured in months rather than years. Canadian LNG capacity, with Qatari capital layered onto it and Qatari commercial relationships directing its output, is a revenue replacement strategy that can be incorporated into Qatari financial planning within the current fiscal year. That is why the framework formalized this week is not a 5-year strategic aspiration. It is a near-term commercial instrument wrapped inside a bilateral cooperation document. Qatar needs volumes moving through a reliable, sanction-proof, conflict-insulated export corridor. It needs those volumes attributed to Qatari commercial relationships within a timeline that damaged Gulf infrastructure cannot satisfy. Both negotiating teams understood this with complete clarity. And the 4-week velocity from initial serious contact to public announcement reflects a negotiating dynamic in which both parties had a profoundly aligned interest in moving without delay. Qatar needed a platform. Canada had one. The question was never whether an agreement would materialize. It was how rapidly the framework could be structured, announced, and operationalized. The answer, as of this week, is approximately 4 weeks. In sovereign energy infrastructure terms, that is essentially instantaneous. Now let us address the American response, because that response is the pivotal variable that will determine how extensively this realignment ultimately propagates. The Trump administration retains options. It holds direct policy instruments. It possesses the capacity to apply pressure on American oil and gas majors with significant Gulf operational exposure. It can deploy diplomatic leverage on Gulf governments through the defense partnerships that have underwritten the region's security architecture for decades. It can signal institutional disapproval of Canadian absorption of Gulf capital through trade policy measures, tariff adjustments, and the variety of informal pressure that Washington has historically applied when Canadian independent foreign policy maneuvers have conflicted with American strategic preferences. All of those instruments exist. The question is whether deploying them would improve or deteriorate the situation from Washington's perspective. The analytically honest answer is that deploying them would almost certainly make the situation worse. Pressuring American companies with Gulf operations accelerates precisely the decoupling those companies are already quietly executing. Pressuring Gulf governments through defense partnerships compels those governments to conduct a rigorous audit of their own dependence on American security guarantees and to accelerate their diversification away from that dependence. Pressuring Canada through trade policy drives Canadian energy strategy toward deeper integration with non-American partners and validates the Gulf calculation that Washington cannot be trusted to refrain from weaponizing economic leverage against its own allies. The blockade has already demonstrated the core problem in vivid terms. Every instrument the Trump administration reaches for to reassert American centrality in Gulf strategic calculation is an instrument that, when deployed, further confirms the concern that drove the diversification in the first place. It is a self-reinforcing dynamic, and it compounds with each iteration. There is a version of American response that would be effective. It would involve de-escalating the blockade, restoring reliable freedom of navigation through the strait, repairing the institutional trust that the past 6 weeks have damaged, and competing for Gulf capital on commercial terms rather than through coercive pressure. That version of response is not currently being signaled from the White House, but it remains available if the administration elects to pursue it. What is categorically not available is a response that reverses the Qatari framework through pressure alone. The framework is signed. The capital commitments are being formalized. Engineering teams are already being mobilized. Canadian regulatory fast-tracking is already in motion. And every week that passes makes the commitments structurally harder to unwind, because physical infrastructure commitments, once steel is in the ground and contracts carry legal force, cannot be reversed through political pressure without triggering a financial and legal confrontation that no party currently has any appetite for. Washington, in other words, has approximately 6 months to alter the trajectory of this realignment through constructive policy. And it has essentially no runway to reverse it through coercion. The longer the current posture persists, the more the framework solidifies as the new baseline rather than a provisional arrangement. That is the strategic reality confronting the Trump administration this week. And the public statements emanating from the White House over the past several days suggest that this reality has not yet been fully absorbed by senior American decision-makers. The operative framing remains one of American power asserting itself against Iranian intransigence. That framing is not inaccurate as a description of the bilateral American-Iranian dynamic, but it is dangerously incomplete as a description of what is simultaneously occurring in the broader system surrounding that bilateral relationship. There is a historical parallel worth naming explicitly because it may help clarify, with the precision that historical comparison sometimes provides, exactly what is happening in the present moment. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo was engineered to demonstrate Gulf leverage over Western economies. It inflicted short-term economic pain on the United States and its allies. But its enduring consequence was that it compelled those economies to restructure their energy sourcing in ways that permanently reduced OPEC's market share and long-term bargaining power. What is unfolding in 2026 is the mirror image of that dynamic. The blockade is not a Gulf instrument directed against the West. It is a Western instrument that has ensnared Gulf producers as collateral damage. But the structural response on the Gulf side is going to closely resemble the structural response of Western consumers half a century ago, a fundamental reorganization of export architecture, a diversification of strategic partnerships, a permanent reduction in the leverage one party can exercise over another through a single geographic choke point. In 1973, the buyers learned they could not depend exclusively on a single supply region. In 2026, the sellers are learning they cannot depend exclusively on a single security partner. And in both cases, the adjustment they execute is structural, not cyclical. Once the alternative infrastructure is constructed, once the relationships are established, once the capital is deployed, the old dependency does not simply resume when conditions normalize. The dependency has been broken. Both parties understand it, and neither party can simply pretend otherwise. Canada did not engineer this position. Prime Minister Carney did not campaign on a platform of becoming the Gulf's alternative export anchor. The LNG Canada facility at Kitimat was not conceived as a contingency hedge against the collapse of Qatari export routes. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was not built with Saudi sovereign wealth fund participation in contemplation. But the infrastructure exists. The capacity exists. The regulatory framework exists. And the capital now flowing toward that infrastructure, from Doha, from Abu Dhabi, from Riyadh, is arriving at a scale and velocity that will reshape the Canadian energy sector for a generation. Mark Carney's government has, perhaps without having fully anticipated it at the moment those policy decisions were being adopted, positioned Canada to absorb precisely this category of capital deployment. The pipeline regulatory fast-tracking, the streamlining of LNG export project approvals, the fuel tax adjustment that transmitted a signal about competitive positioning, the explicit reframing of Canada as an energy security partner rather than merely a commodity exporter. All of these decisions appeared, 6 months ago, like sound but incremental policy adjustments. In retrospect, they appear to be preparation for a moment that nobody in Ottawa had quite imagined. The moment has arrived regardless. For Canada, the implications extend considerably beyond the direct economic impact of the Qatari framework and the broader Gulf capital inflow. Canada is being asked, by its own newly acquired positioning in the global energy system, to conduct itself as a nation with genuine strategic weight. That is a transition the Canadian political class has not been required to navigate within living memory. Canada's foreign policy posture for most of the post-Cold War period has been that of a middle power with strong values and constrained hard power capacity. What is occurring now is that Canada is becoming an energy security anchor for multiple regional blocs, a role that carries a fundamentally different set of expectations. Those expectations include the ability to defend the infrastructure that partner nations are investing in. They include maintaining the regulatory and political stability that renders that infrastructure bankable over multi-decade horizons. They include navigating the inevitable moments when American strategic priorities and partner country interests diverge, a challenge that Canada has historically resolved by aligning with Washington, and which it is now discovering may require a more genuinely independent posture. And they include something that Canadian policymakers have not yet been compelled to think through with genuine seriousness. If the Gulf states are hedging against American reliability by positioning capital inside Canadian infrastructure, what happens when the next Canadian-American strategic disagreement materializes? What happens when a future Washington, confronting a different crisis in a different theater, surveys Canadian energy infrastructure and Canadian partnerships with Gulf producers and concludes that applying pressure is strategically warranted? That scenario is not imminent, but it is no longer implausible. And Ottawa will have to begin thinking about it, carefully, seriously, and without the comfortable assumption that American and Canadian interests will always converge. None of these questions yield clean answers. But the fact that they have become serious questions for the first time in decades is itself a precise measure of the magnitude of what has changed. This week, at a quiet gathering in Ottawa that did not appear on the front pages of most American outlets, the global energy map shifted again. Not because a war concluded, not because a new field was discovered, not because a technological breakthrough upended the existing order, but because the world's largest LNG exporter looked unflinchingly at its own strategic future and concluded that its next chapter had to be written somewhere other than the geography that built its last one. Qatar came to Canada because Qatar had to. The other Gulf states are following for precisely the same reason. And the Trump administration's blockade, designed to project American coercive power, is instead demonstrating the inherent limits of coercion. Because when the cascading side effects of your own strategy benefit your strategic competitors more than the strategy benefits you, and when your long-term partners begin quietly but decisively reassessing the value of remaining your partners, coercion ceases to function as leverage. It becomes an accelerant. 230 oil tankers remain stranded in the Gulf. The mines remain in the water. The blockade remains in effect. Oil remains above $100 per barrel. And the infrastructure currently being constructed on the Pacific coast of British Columbia, with capital from Doha and technical partnership from Qatar Energy, is going to outlast all of it. That is the story of this week. And the next chapter is already being authored tonight, in conversations occurring between Abu Dhabi and Ottawa, between Riyadh and Calgary, between Kuwait City and Vancouver. The Gulf is pivoting. Canada is absorbing the pivot. And the old architecture, the one premised on the assumption that Washington would always serve as the indispensable security partner for Gulf energy, is being quietly, methodically, and perhaps irreversibly retired. If this category of analysis is what draws you here, if you want to understand where these shifts are heading before the mainstream coverage has even begun to frame the right questions, subscribe now and activate your notifications. Because the next development in this story will not wait for anyone to be fully prepared for it. The framework has been signed. The capital is in motion. The infrastructure is being built. And the world that emerges from the far side of this realignment is not going to resemble the world that entered it. Stay informed. We will be tracking every development as it unfolds.